everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to cover the Sri Lankan economic crisis explained. This crisis began in 2019 and has continued to the present day. You may have seen a lot of articles recently in the news talking about the food shortages in Sri Lanka, not being able to obtain gas. Gas stations are completely out of gas. There's protests, riot. I think the government recently changed. The president stepped down. We're going to go into that today and cover why that happened. So, the story began when Gotabaya Rajapaksa, hopefully I'm saying that right, became president of Sri Lanka in 2019. Now, the government under him made a bunch of large tax cuts, and that included a result of that was a 33.5% decline in the number of taxpayers, which is huge. So there were like a third less taxpayers after these changes. Also, the value-add tax, which is used for transactions between different goods in the economy, was reduced by 8%. Corporate tax was reduced by 4%. The tax on corporation profits. There was an employee withholding tax that was completely abolished. So, again, corporations would pay this on employees' earnings. And then there was a 2% tax on imports and manufactured products that was also completely eliminated. So the result of this was that the Sri Lankan government tax revenue decreased massively, and the government decided to just print money in record amounts to cover the loss of revenue. For an image, we have Jay Powell of the U.S. Federal Reserve down there with the money printer go burr. And the International Monetary Fund, which again is an international body that kind of tries to help governments with financial policy, they warned Sri Lanka to stop printing money and to raise interest rates and raise taxes to cover their deficits, but Sri Lankan government didn't really listen. And then Sri Lanka also doubled its foreign debt between 2010 and 2020. So a pretty significant increase. Now, factors that accelerated the Sri Lankan economic crisis were a decrease in tourism from 2020 to the present, and some tourism has resumed in 2021 and then the beginning of 2022, but still not to the levels of 2019. And then the Sri Lankan government banned chemical fertilizers in 2021, which they later reversed, but that still triggered a significant decline in food production within the country. And then the government also used to subsidize the chemical fertilizers. So they basically would lower the amount farmers would have to pay to get the fertilizers, but they stopped doing that, which raised the prices for the farmers, and then also resulted in a decline in food production. Another factor that accelerated the crisis was the Eastern European conflict this year, which again has accelerated raw material inflation. And then the Sri Lankan government continued working on some large infrastructure projects, which were a cost to the government that they had to fund despite less revenue from taxes. So a result of this was a shortage of commodities, food, petrol, gasoline, and household goods. There's been civil unrest, a lot of different protests. The inflation rate is now at 30%. Just last month, it was at 20%, so accelerating pretty sharply. Sri Lanka has devalued their currency. And you can see the headline down here, Sri Lanka can't find cash to pay even one ship for petrol. You can see that everything from food to cooking gas has just resulted in Asia's fastest inflation. And, spilling over into some political issues. Moral of the story, I would say, be skeptical of policy decisions, especially government policies that can create short-term benefits but create long-term risks. And too much debt is like an addiction. Too much debt can create great short-term conditions but leave a longer-term hangover. And what else could we take from this example of Sri Lanka? So I have a graph here of the U.S. M2 money supply and Sri Lanka M2 money supply, which is indicative of basically how much money was created by the government. And you can see that the rate of the U.S. and Sri Lanka are pretty correlated. Now, the U.S. is definitely not in exactly the same situation as Sri Lanka because They haven't massively decreased their government revenue, but still, this chart is something to keep an eye on. And then here's another interesting chart. Government debt to GDP. You can again see that the US is actually ahead of Sri Lanka in the amount of debt relative to the GDP of the economy. And so I have to do a plug for cryptocurrencies. Some of the benefits of cryptocurrency and how they could help this situation is that they decentralize some economic power away from the central governments and politicians who run them, and they prevent bureaucrats who sometimes have short-term incentives from making decisions that cause longer-term damage to economies. So maybe a politician is just concerned with trying to get reelected in a couple months or get elected in a year, and they just want some short-term economic growth, but they aren't too concerned with causing long-term damage. In some cases that can happen. And then the other thing is cryptocurrencies increase economic competition in the global economy, which can create a more open and free market and improve overall economic growth. So again, it's kind of decentralizing an economic power lever from the governments and allowing different organizations to compete with each other. So which I think is beneficial for the free market because you don't have essentially a monopoly on that. Now, obviously right now this is hard to say with the crypto markets crashing pretty heavily, but these statements are more geared towards something 5, 10, many years down the road as these technologies mature, in a similar fashion to the internet. So, all right. Well, hope everyone enjoyed the recap today and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.